My husband died 15 years ago. Every month, I sent his mom $1,000 until I found out they faked his death. For 15 years, Dominique Vance never forgot her duty. Despite building a successful architecture firm from nothing, she faithfully sent $1,000 to her mother-in-law Peggy every month. A final promise to Sebastian before the car accident took him away. But when a routine banking glitch revealed an impossible detail, she uncovered a horrifying truth. Everything she believed about her husband's death and her obligation to his grieving mother wasn't what it seemed. The monthly payments weren't supporting an elderly widow struggling to make ends meet. They were feeding a dark conspiracy that had stolen 15 years of her life and $180,000 of her hard-earned money. Now Dominique faced a decision that could change everything. Before we dive into this shocking story, subscribe to the channel so you're always first to know. Hit like if you're ready for the next revelation, and comment where you're watching from. New York, Miami, or maybe Atlanta. All right, let's continue with Dominique as she discovers the truth about her monthly payments. Dominique Vance stood in her corner office overlooking downtown Atlanta, staring at the bank transfer confirmation on her laptop screen. $1,000. Same amount, same day, same recipient account number she'd memorized by heart. The 15th anniversary of this routine had passed 3 months ago, yet her fingers still hesitated over the send button every month. Not because she questioned the obligation. Sebastian had made her promise, and a promise to a dying husband was sacred, but because each payment felt like reopening a wound that never quite healed. The notification sound pulled her back to the present. Another email from her financial advisor. Dominique, we really need to discuss your retirement portfolio. At your current savings rate. She closed the email without reading further. Margaret Chin meant well, but she didn't understand. Some debts couldn't be measured in compound interest and future security. Some promises mattered more than 401ks. Her architecture firm was thriving. 3 major contracts this quarter alone, a team of 12 talented designers, her name on buildings across the Southeast. She'd built everything from nothing after Sebastian died, channeling grief into ambition, transforming survivors' guilt into skyscrapers and luxury condos. The critics called her designs hauntingly beautiful and emotionally resonant. They had no idea how literal that description was. But success came with a price tag that extended beyond tax brackets. After payroll, overhead, business loans, and her modest apartment in Midtown, there wasn't much cushion for retirement savings or emergency funds. Her accountant had pointed this out last quarter with barely concealed concern. You're cash flowing beautifully, but you're not building personal wealth, Marcus had said, his spreadsheets telling a story of someone who prioritized everyone else's security over her own. Every dollar had a purpose. Every dollar except those 1,000 that disappeared into Peggy Rhodes's account like clockwork. Dominique? The Riverside development team is here for the 3 o'clock. Her assistant Janelle appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, perfectly professional as always. But Dominique caught the slight concern in her eyes, the same look people had been giving her for 15 years. The look that said, you work too hard. You sacrifice too much. You're allowed to move on. They didn't understand. Moving on meant betraying Sebastian's memory. Moving on meant admitting that their 5 years of marriage mattered less than her comfort now. Moving on meant breaking the promise she'd made to take care of his mother, the woman who'd raised the man she'd loved with every fiber of her being. Dominique closed her laptop and straightened her suit jacket. Armani, tailored, the armor of someone who'd learned that looking successful was half the battle of becoming successful. Tell them I'll be right there. But her phone buzzed before she could leave. A text from Peggy Rhodes, the first personal contact in months beyond the automated payment received confirmations. Need to discuss the payment arrangement. Can you call me this evening? Important. Dominique frowned, her architect's mind immediately sensing something structurally wrong. In 15 years, Peggy had never wanted to discuss anything. She'd accepted the money with the same cold efficiency that had marked their relationship since Sebastian's funeral. Never asking about Dominique's business, never acknowledging the sacrifice these payments represented, never offering the maternal comfort that might have made the grief bearable. The few times they'd spoken, Peggy's voice carried the sharp edge of blame, as if Dominique's survival somehow diminished Sebastian's death, as if being the one who lived was a crime that required eternal penance. The monthly payments had become Dominique's way of proving her devotion, of demonstrating that Sebastian's death hadn't freed her from the Rhodes family, that she would honor his memory through sacrifice even when it hurt. But something about this text felt different. Wrong. Like a beam that looked solid but was secretly compromised, waiting for the right pressure to reveal its weakness. Dominique pocketed her phone and headed to the conference room, but her mind kept circling back to that message. Peggy had always insisted on the direct deposit, claimed it was easier for her fixed-income budget, simpler for an elderly widow who didn't understand modern banking. She'd provided the account information at Sebastian's funeral, her hands shaking with what Dominique had assumed was grief, writing the routing and account numbers on the back of a memorial program while mourners filed past the closed casket. Now she wondered, had those trembling hands been grief? Or something else entirely? The Riverside meeting passed in a blur of renderings and zoning discussions, but Dominique's attention kept drifting. When had she last actually verified where that money was going? When had she last visited Peggy at the modest house in Decatur she claimed to be barely maintaining on Social Security? When had she last questioned why a woman living on a fixed income needed exactly $1,000 every month? No more, no less. Despite 15 years of inflation and rising costs. The answer settled in her chest like a structural crack she'd been trained to spot, but had somehow missed. Never. She'd never questioned any of it. She'd simply accepted her role as the dutiful widow, forever indebted to the family of the man she'd lost. That evening, after her team had gone home and the office lights cast long shadows across her drafting table, Dominique opened her banking app with the systematic precision she brought to every project. Time to inspect the foundation she'd been building her guilt upon for 15 years. What she was about to discover would prove that some structures, no matter how carefully maintained, were built on lies from the very beginning. Dominique clicked through 15 years of bank statements, her architect's eye cataloging the pattern with uncomfortable precision. January 2010 through December 2024. 180 transfers. Not a single month missed. Not even when her startup firm was hemorrhaging cash and she'd maxed out 3 credit cards to make payroll. Their marriage had been brief but incandescent. 5 years of the kind of love that made other couples jealous at dinner parties. He'd been a corporate attorney with ambitions that matched her own, someone who understood that success required sacrifice. They'd planned everything together, the firm she'd build, the partner track he'd make, the house in Buckhead they'd buy once both their careers stabilized. Then came the business trip to Charleston, the rainy highway, the semi-truck that crossed the median. The state trooper had called it instantaneous. She'd called it impossible. Peggy had been cold even at the funeral, standing rigid in her black dress, while Dominique collapsed into the arms of colleagues who'd barely known Sebastian. He was my only child, Peggy had said, as if Dominique's 5 years couldn't compete with her lifetime of motherhood. As if widow ranked lower than mother in the hierarchy of grief. The unspoken accusation hung between them. You get to rebuild your life. I can only bury my son. The monthly payments had started as penance. Sebastian had mentioned once, casually over breakfast, that his mother worried about money. When I make partner, I'll help her out, he'd said, buttering toast without looking up. He never made partner. So Dominique had taken on the obligation like she took on everything Sebastian left unfinished, his unpaid parking tickets, his half-read books, his promise to call his mother more often. $1,000 every month for 15 years. Margaret Chin's voice echoed in her memory. At your current savings rate, you'll need to work until you're 75. Dominique was 43. Her retirement account held roughly what most financial advisors recommended someone have by 30. She justified it as honoring Sebastian's memory, but sitting alone in her office at 8 p.m., staring at $180,000 in cumulative transfers, Dominique wondered if honor had quietly transformed into something else. Fear, maybe. Fear that stopping the payments would mean admitting Sebastian was truly gone. Fear that Peggy's accusatory silence was right, that Dominique had failed him by surviving. Her phone lit up with Peggy's text again. Need to discuss the payment arrangement. Important. 15 years of unquestioning devotion. And now something was important enough to break the silence. Dominique's finger hovered over Peggy's contact information, but instinct made her open her banking app instead. The banking app glowed in the dim office light, displaying transaction details Dominique had never bothered to examine closely. She tapped on the most recent transfer, expanding the details she'd always scrolled past before. Recipient name, account number, routing information. Then she saw it. A small notation at the bottom. Linked account holder, tax ID. The 9-digit number that followed made her breath catch. Sebastian's social security number. Dominique stared at the screen, her mind racing through logical explanations. A joint account from before his death that somehow remained linked. An administrative error in the bank system. Peggy had added Sebastian as a secondary account holder years ago for estate planning purposes. Anything except the impossible truth staring back at her from the glowing screen. She navigated to her saved payees, pulled up Peggy's account information, and tapped through every available detail. The account had been opened in March 2010, 2 weeks after Sebastian's funeral. Primary account holder, Peggy Rhodes. Secondary account holder, Sebastian Rhodes. Tax ID active. Last system verification, December 2024. Last month. The system had verified Sebastian's social security number was active last month. Dead people didn't maintain active tax IDs. The Social Security Administration Death Index was meticulous precisely to prevent fraud. When someone died, their number got flagged within weeks, sometimes days. Banks ran regular verification checks against that database. Active status meant active life. Unless the Social Security Administration had no record of Sebastian Rhodes's death. Her hands trembled as she opened a new browser tab. Social Security Death Index. Free public search. She'd never looked before because why would she? She'd identified his body at the morgue. She'd planned his funeral. She'd scattered his ashes in the Chattahoochee River like he'd once mentioned wanting, back when death was theoretical and far away. The search form loaded. She entered Sebastian's name, birth date, the social security number she'd memorized from years of filing joint tax returns. Her finger hovered over the search button. The results loaded instantly, no records found. Dominique ran the search again. Different spelling variations, different date ranges, every possible combination. Each search returned the same hollow response. No records found. She sat back in her leather chair, the Atlanta skyline glittering through her office windows. 15 years of grief. $180,000. And a dead man whose social security number the government still considered active. Peggy's text glowed on her phone. Need to discuss the payment arrangement. Important. Now Dominique understood. Something was about to change, and Peggy needed to control the narrative before the truth emerged on its own. Marcus Webb's office existed in the kind of building that successful people visited but never mentioned. Third floor of a renovated warehouse in West Midtown, sandwiched between a craft brewery and a yoga studio. The private investigator had come recommended by Dominique's attorney with a single caveat. He finds things people don't want found. Be prepared for answers you might not want. Dominique wanted answers more than she wanted comfort. Webb listened without interrupting as she explained the active social security number, the missing death index entry, the 15 years of monthly payments to a mother-in-law who'd accepted her money with cold efficiency. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with the alert watchfulness of someone trained to notice details others missed. Former FBI, her attorney had mentioned. White-collar crime division. I need the accident report first, Webb said, already typing notes into his tablet. Official documentation creates the paper trail. If your husband faked his death, someone had to sign off on making it look real. The accident report arrived in Webb's email 3 days later, forwarded from the South Carolina Highway Patrol archives. Dominique read it in her office after her staff had left. Single vehicle collision during severe weather. Sebastian Rhodes, age 32, pronounced dead at scene. Body transported to Charleston Memorial Hospital. Cause of death, massive blunt force trauma. Examining physician, Dr. Leonard Hastings. Webb called an hour later, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd found exactly what he'd expected. Dr. Leonard Hastings had his medical license suspended by the South Carolina Board of Medical Examiners in August 2011, permanently revoked in 2013. The charges were falsifying medical records and death certificates as part of an insurance fraud scheme. Dominique felt the floor shift beneath her chair. How many death certificates? At least 7 that they could prove. Probably more they couldn't. Hastings was signing off on deaths that never happened, creating paperwork for people who wanted to disappear. The investigation started when an insurance company got suspicious about the number of accidental deaths he'd certified in a 6-month period. Webb paused. Your husband's death certificate was signed 18 months before Hastings got caught. It would have been right in the middle of his operation. She stared at the accident report on her screen, seeing it now for what it was. Not documentation of tragedy, but a carefully constructed lie signed by a doctor willing to commit fraud for the right price. The closed casket suddenly made sense. The quick cremation Peggy had insisted on, claiming Sebastian would have wanted simplicity. The ashes scattered in the river before Dominique could question whether those remains were even human. There's more, Webb continued. I pulled property records for Peggy Rhodes. She doesn't own the house in Decatur you've been sending payments to. She sold it in 2012 for $400,000, cash buyer. Current address on file with the state is a P.O. box. Dominique's voice came out steadier than she felt. Find out where she actually lives. Already working on it. Follow the money, and we'll find the truth. The truth was what Dominique had been avoiding for 15 years. Now she was ready to face it. Webb's follow-up email arrived with attachments Dominique opened in sequence, each one dismantling another piece of the reality she'd accepted for 15 years. Bank records showing her monthly transfers immediately routed to a secondary account. Property tax documents for an address in Boca Raton, Florida. Satellite imagery of a waterfront estate that made her midtown apartment look like graduate student housing. The property was registered to a trust, PRS Holdings, incorporated in Delaware with Peggy Rhodes listed as trustee. Purchase price in 2011, $2.4 million. Current estimated value, $4.7 million. The house sprawled across 3 acres of prime Florida coastline, complete with private dock, infinity pool, and enough square footage to comfortably house a family of 12. Dominique zoomed in on the satellite image, her architect's eye automatically cataloging the details. Mediterranean revival style, probably 6 bedrooms minimum, chef's kitchen visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows facing the ocean. The kind of house she designed for tech executives and hedge fund managers. Not the kind of house a widow on Social Security could afford, even with an extra $1,000 a month. Webb's accompanying report laid out the financial archaeology with clinical precision. Peggy had purchased the property 3 months after selling her Decatur house, paying cash through the trust to avoid public records linking her name directly to the address. Utility bills averaged $3,000 monthly. Property taxes ran $42,000 annually. The Homeowners Association fees alone exceeded what Peggy had claimed was her entire fixed income. The report continued with evidence that made Dominique's stomach clench. Credit card statements Webb had obtained through methods she decided not to question. Charges at Miami restaurants where entrees started at $75. Regular purchases at Neiman Marcus and Saks. A Tesla Model S registered to the trust in 2019. Wine shipments from Napa Valley vineyards that cost more per bottle than Dominique typically spent on groceries. This wasn't a struggling widow barely surviving on government assistance. This was someone living a lifestyle that required substantial ongoing income. The monthly $1,000 she'd sacrificed her retirement to send was pocket change compared to Peggy's actual expenses. A rounding error in a budget built on something far larger than one architect's guilt. Webb had included recent photographs from public social media accounts linked to the address. A charity gala at a Boca Raton country club. Peggy Rhodes in a designer gown, champagne flute raised, smiling beside people whose net worth probably exceeded Dominique's entire firm's valuation. Posted 6 weeks ago with the caption, "Grateful for another beautiful year in paradise." Paradise built on lies. Webb's final note appeared at the bottom of the report. Utility records show 2 adults living at the residence full-time. Property has been under surveillance for 48 hours. You need to see this for yourself. He'd attached a video file labeled Subject B, December 10th, 24, 8:47 Eastern Standard Time. Dominique's hand trembled as she clicked play, knowing that whatever she was about to see would confirm the impossible truth she'd been circling since that first glimpse of Sebastian's active Social Security number. The video loaded in grainy morning light, shot from distance with a telephoto lens. A man emerged from the French doors facing the pool, coffee mug in hand, wearing linen pants and an untucked white shirt. He moved with unhurried confidence toward the dock where a sailboat bobbed gently. Dominique pressed pause, zoomed in on the frozen frame, and felt 15 years of grief collapse into a single moment of recognition. Older, yes. Grayer at the temples, lines around the eyes that hadn't existed when she'd kissed him goodbye for that Charleston trip. But the way he tilted his head while sipping coffee, the particular set of his shoulders, the gait she'd watched cross their apartment 1,000 mornings, those hadn't changed. Sebastian Rhodes was alive. She watched the video 17 times before calling Webb. I'm flying to Florida tomorrow. I need his current name and daily routine. Dominique, let me handle the surveillance. I need to see him myself. I need to look at his face and know this is real. Webb's hesitation crackled through the line before he relented. He's using the name Marcus Hastings. Yes, same last name as the doctor who signed his death certificate. Probably the son or a relative who was part of the scheme. He plays tennis at the country club Tuesdays and Thursdays, lunches at Oceana most days around 1. Drives a Porsche Cayenne registered to the trust. Marcus Hastings. Sebastian had erased Sebastian Rhodes so completely he'd taken the name of his co-conspirator. Dominique landed in Fort Lauderdale Thursday morning and drove a rental car to the Boca Raton Country Club with Webb surveillance notes and a camera with a lens that could capture detail from 100 yards. She dressed for Florida money, Valentino sunglasses, silk blouse, the persona of someone who belonged among the wealth casually displayed on every tennis court and golf cart. She found him on court 3, playing doubles with men whose Rolexes caught sunlight with every serve. Sebastian moved well for 47, still athletic despite the softer middle that came with 15 years of luxury. His partner called him Mark, laughing at something he'd said with the easy camaraderie of established friendship. Dominique raised her camera with hands steadier than her breathing and captured evidence in methodical sequence. Profile shot showing the familiar curve of his jaw. Three-quarter angle revealing the scar above his left eyebrow from a college soccer injury. Full face when he turned toward the clubhouse, removing his sunglasses to wipe sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The exact gesture she'd watched him make hundreds of times in their kitchen, their bedroom, their life together. The camera's shutter clicked 23 times before Sebastian glanced in her direction. For one suspended moment, their eyes met across the manicured distance, and Dominique saw recognition flicker across his face before he deliberately turned away. Not shock, not guilt, just the cold calculation of someone who'd been caught, but wasn't surprised. He'd always known this moment might come. He simply hadn't expected it would take her 15 years. Webb's expanded investigation arrived while Dominique was still in Florida, the PDF attachment weighing heavy with documentation that transformed personal betrayal into prosecutable crime. She read it in her hotel room overlooking the Atlantic, the same ocean Sebastian could see from his stolen paradise 3 miles south. The life insurance policy had been taken out 8 months before the accident. $2 million through Pinnacle Life, a company that specialized in high-value policies for professionals. Sebastian had listed Peggy as primary beneficiary. The application showed it was signed January 2009, 6 months after their wedding, with Peggy's beneficiary status explicitly designated as irrevocable. Webb had obtained the payout records through contacts Dominique again chose not to examine too closely. $1.9 million after fees, deposited into an account at Cayman National Bank 3 months after Dr. Hastings signed the fraudulent death certificate. The timing suggested careful planning, long enough after the death to avoid suspicion, quick enough to fund their disappearance before questions emerged. The money trail wound through offshore accounts with the complexity of someone who'd consulted experts. Cayman to Switzerland to a series of Delaware LLCs that eventually funneled into the trust that purchased the Boca Raton estate. Sebastian's legal training evident in every layer of protection, every jurisdictional boundary crossed to obscure the source. But the insurance fraud was just the foundation. Webb's analysis revealed the full scope of their operation. Peggy had filed for Social Security survivor benefits as Sebastian's mother, collecting $800 monthly for 15 years. Another $144,000. She'd claimed Sebastian's modest 401k as next of kin, $37,000 more. There'd been a wrongful death settlement against the trucking company whose driver allegedly caused the accident, $250,000 that Webb traced to the same offshore network. Combined with Dominique's $180,000 in payments, Sebastian and Peggy had extracted nearly $3 million from his staged death. They'd turned his fake funeral into a profit center, monetizing grief with the efficiency of a hostile corporate takeover. Webb's report included a final detail that made Dominique's hands shake with rage. Sebastian had taken out a second life insurance policy 2 weeks before the accident. $500,000 with Dominique listed as beneficiary. She'd received that payout, used it to launch her architecture firm. He'd ensured she'd have enough to survive and enough guilt to keep sending money to his mother forever. The brilliance was almost admirable. He'd engineered Dominique's success and her exploitation simultaneously, creating a self-sustaining system where her growing income meant growing payments to fund his hidden life. Sebastian had bet on her loyalty, her guilt, her love, and he'd won for a decade and a half. Until now. Dominique canceled the December transfer from her hotel room with the same decisive finality she used to reject flawed architectural designs. 15 years of automatic payments ended with a single tap on her phone screen. Transfer canceled by user. She flew back to Atlanta and waited. Webb had predicted Peggy would respond within 48 hours. It took 36. The first call came Tuesday morning during a client meeting. Dominique let it go to voicemail, watching Peggy's name flash on her screen. The message was brief, clipped, the elderly widow act stripped down to its essential manipulation. Dominique, there seems to be an issue with this month's transfer. Please call me immediately to resolve this. No pleasantries. No concern for Dominique's well-being. Just the naked demand of someone whose income stream had unexpectedly dried up. Dominique didn't call back. The second call came that evening. Then a third. By Wednesday morning, her voicemail contained 6 messages, each one escalating in urgency and barely contained panic. I don't understand why you're doing this. That money is essential for my living expenses. Dominique, I've been patient with your lack of communication, but this is becoming serious. I have bills due. You made a promise to Sebastian. Are you really going to dishonor his memory over some banking error? The texts started Wednesday afternoon, arriving in clusters that suggested Peggy was losing her carefully maintained composure. We need to talk about your obligations. Call me today. I'm going to assume there's been some misunderstanding. The money needs to be transferred by Friday, or there will be consequences. I have documentation about certain aspects of Sebastian's estate that you might find concerning. Let's discuss this like adults. Dominique forwarded every message to Webb, building the evidence file that would eventually become federal exhibit material. Thursday brought the call Dominique had been anticipating. Peggy's voice had transformed from elderly widow to something harder, sharper, stripped of pretense. I know you've been investigating. Whatever you think you've discovered, you don't understand the full situation. There are complications that affect you too. That insurance money you used to start your firm? You might want to think carefully about where that came from before you make any rash decisions. The implication was clear. If Dominique exposed the fraud, Peggy would claim Dominique had been complicit all along. It was a beautiful threat. Professional, calculated, leveraging Dominique's success against her. It was also being recorded on Webb's equipment, adding extortion to the growing list of federal charges. Dominique ended the call without responding and texted Webb 3 words, set up the meeting. Time to give Peggy the confrontation she'd been demanding. Webb arranged everything with the precision of someone who'd orchestrated countless federal investigations. Aria, a high-end restaurant in Buckhead where Atlanta's elite conducted business over $20 cocktails and $50 steaks. Dominique arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a wire so thin it felt like expensive jewelry against her skin. Webb's team occupied 3 tables positioned for optimal audio coverage, their surveillance equipment disguised as laptops and phones. Peggy swept in exactly on time, her designer clothes and confident bearing announcing someone who belonged in spaces like this. She'd abandoned the frail widow persona entirely, moving with the assured grace of someone who'd been living well for 15 years on stolen money. Dominique. Peggy's smile was cold as she took her seat. I'm glad you finally decided to be reasonable. I wanted to understand, Dominique said, keeping her voice steady. 15 years is a long time to maintain a lie. A lie. Peggy laughed, sharp and dismissive. That's one way to put it. I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement. You got to play the grieving widow, build your little architecture firm on sympathy and Sebastian's insurance money. We got to live the life Sebastian deserved before you trapped him in that mediocre marriage. The wire captured every word, every inflection of contempt. You faked his death, Dominique said. You collected nearly $3 million in fraudulent claims. You let me grieve for a man who was alive. And you made it so easy. Peggy leaned forward, her eyes glittering. All that guilt, all that devotion to Sebastian's memory. $1,000 every month, like clockwork. Do you know how much we laughed about that? How pathetically predictable you were. Tell me how you did it, Dominique said. I want to understand how you orchestrated everything. And Peggy, drunk on her own cleverness and 15 years of getting away with it, told her everything. The planning that started 6 months before the accident. The doctor who signed death certificates for $20,000. The closed casket filled with sandbags. The offshore accounts and shell corporations. The wrongful death settlement they'd split with the trucking companies inside man. Sebastian was brilliant, Peggy said, her voice warming with pride. Every detail planned perfectly. He knew you'd honor your promise to take care of me. He knew your guilt would keep you sending money long after most people would have moved on. He understood you better than you understood yourself. Webb's signal came through Dominique's earpiece. They had enough. More than enough. There's just one thing I don't understand, Dominique said. Why did you want to meet today? After 15 years, why reach out now? Peggy's smile turned calculating. Because Sebastian and I are planning to move. Europe, maybe the Caribbean. Somewhere without extradition treaties with the United States. We need a lump sum to facilitate the transition. $200,000 should cover it. Consider it your final payment for all those years of Sebastian's love. Blackmail, Dominique said. On top of everything else. Call it what you want. You have 48 hours to transfer the money, or I start making calls about how you knowingly used fraudulent insurance proceeds to build your firm. I have documentation that will destroy everything you've built. Dominique stood, her hand touching the wire beneath her blouse. I don't think you'll be making any calls, Peggy. The confusion on Peggy's face lasted only a moment before FBI agents converged from 3 directions, badges displayed, Miranda rights delivered with professional efficiency. Webb appeared beside Dominique as they led Peggy away in handcuffs. That was perfect. She gave us everything we needed, and then some. Dominique watched through the restaurant windows as they loaded Peggy into an unmarked car. 15 years of lies, ending in a Buckhead parking lot under the late afternoon sun. What happens now? She asked. Now. Webb's smile was grim. Now justice catches up with people who thought they were untouchable. The arrests happened simultaneously at dawn, coordinated across state lines with the precision of a military operation. In Boca Raton, a separate team arrived at the waterfront estate with warrants for Marcus Hastings, also known as Sebastian Rhodes, also known as the man who'd been legally dead for 15 years. Agent Sarah Chun, the lead investigator, called it one of the cleanest wire fraud cases she'd handled in 20 years. Your mother-in-law basically prosecuted herself, Chun said. We've got conspiracy, wire fraud, insurance fraud, identity theft, and 15 years of evidence. The federal charges carried maximum sentences that would ensure Sebastian and Peggy spent their remaining years in facilities considerably less luxurious than their Florida paradise. Sebastian faced 35 years. Peggy, accounting for her age, was looking at 20 minimum. Both defendants pleaded guilty in exchange for reduced sentences, unwilling to face a jury with Dominique's testimony and Peggy's recorded confession. Sebastian got 22 years in federal prison. Peggy received 15. The judge's statement during sentencing addressed Dominique directly. No amount of punishment can restore what was stolen from you. Not just money, but years of grief built on manufactured lies. This court hopes these sentences provide some measure of justice. The civil suit was almost anticlimactic by comparison. Dominique's attorneys filed for full restitution of the $180,000 plus 15 years of compound interest, pain and suffering damages, and seizure of assets purchased with fraudulent proceeds. The Boca Raton estate, the offshore accounts, the luxury vehicles, everything was liquidated to satisfy the judgment. The final settlement exceeded $400,000. Dominique deposited the check on a Tuesday morning and felt nothing resembling satisfaction. The money couldn't buy back the years she'd spent grieving a man who'd weaponized her love. It couldn't erase the retirement savings she'd sacrificed, but it could fund the future she'd deferred for 15 years. She invested half in retirement accounts that would finally put her on track for financial security. The other half went to a scholarship fund for young architects, the Dominique Vance Fellowship for students who'd overcome adversity. The fund's mission statement was simple: for those who know that the strongest structures are built by people who've learned to support themselves first. 3 months after the sentencing, Dominique stood in her renovated office, looking at blueprints for her most ambitious project yet, a mixed-use development in downtown Atlanta that would bear her name on the cornerstone. Margaret Chen had called with updated financial projections. At her current trajectory, Dominique would be able to retire comfortably at 65, maybe earlier. "You finally started investing in yourself," Margaret had said. "It's remarkable what happens when you stop sending money to criminals." Dominique's phone buzzed with a text from Webb, the final item she'd requested: Sebastian's prison intake photo. She opened it once, studied the man who'd traded their marriage for financial freedom, then deleted it without saving. She didn't need reminders of what she'd lost. She had blueprints showing what she was building. The monthly ritual of sending $1,000 had been replaced with a new routine. Every first of the month, Dominique transferred money to her retirement account and watched the balance grow. Sebastian had taught her that loyalty without verification was just another word for exploitation. Peggy had taught her that grief could be weaponized by anyone patient enough to wait for the perfect moment. But Dominique had taught herself something more valuable: that closing the door on the past didn't mean dishonoring it. It meant refusing to let it define the future. She turned back to her blueprints, her architect's eye cataloging the clean lines and structural integrity of a building that would stand long after everyone involved in its creation was gone. Good design required strong foundations, honest materials, and the wisdom to know when something was worth saving and when it needed to be demolished completely. Sebastian Rhodes had been demolished. The widow he'd created had been demolished with him. What remained was Dominique Vance, architect, survivor, and finally free.